Sports cars are meant to be sleek, powerful, and thrilling. But some creations went so far off track that they became ultra bizarre. Strange styling, confusing engineering choices, and ideas that looked good on paper but failed on the road turned these machines into some of the weirdest rides ever made. They were bold, they were different, but in the end, they just made no sense at all. Here are the 13 ultra-bizarre sports cars that made no sense. Stick around till the end, and don't forget to subscribe.
Dear viewers, we have set a goal to reach 30,000 subscribers by the end of this year. With your support, we can make it happen, so don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us on this journey. Thank you.
The 1970 Marcos Mantis is one of those rare cars that almost defies categorization because it straddled the thin line between ambition and absurdity. Marcos, a small British sports car manufacturer best known for lightweight wooden chassis roadsters and race cars in the 1960s, suddenly decided that it wanted to play in the big leagues. This was the era of the wedge-shaped supercar, when Lamborghini was stunning the world with the Countach concept, Lotus was experimenting with wild angular forms, and even Ferrari was slowly transitioning away from rounded elegance toward sharper, more futuristic lines. Marcos, with far fewer resources but equal amounts of imagination, wanted to show that it, too, could produce a futuristic grand tour that blended style, power, and exclusivity. The result was the Mantis, a car that looked less like an exotic supercar and more like an abstract design sketch that accidentally made it onto the road. At first glance, the Mantis was striking, but not in the way Marcos had intended. Its proportions were unusual, even unsettling. A long, low, wedge-like nose, slabby body sides, and an oddly upright cabin that seemed out of step with the sleekness of the rest of the car. It looked, as many enthusiasts would later joke, like a melted wedge of cheese or a kit car that had been awkwardly stretched in Photoshop decades before Photoshop existed. The windscreen was vast and steeply raked, but the roofline suddenly bulged upward, giving it a gawky stance that betrayed its attempt at futuristic elegance. Where the Countach and Lotus Esprit embodied sharp precision, the Mantis looked bloated and awkward, as if it had been designed in a rush without a proper understanding of proportion. Beneath the eccentric exterior, Marcos powered the Mantis with Ford's Essex 3.0-liter V6, a reliable engine that delivered around 140 horsepower. On paper, this was underwhelming for a car meant to compete in the budding supercar market, where rivals boasted V8s, V12s, and top speeds well past 150 miles per hour. The Mantis, despite its flamboyant exterior, was not much faster than a Ford Capri, which cost a fraction of the price. This mismatch between appearance and performance created a credibility gap. It looked like a spaceship, but drove like a warmed-over family coupe. The driving dynamics were not disastrous. The car handled decently thanks to its low weight and relatively good suspension geometry, but anyone expecting Ferrari-like thrills would have been disappointed. The Mantis was, in essence, a stylish grand tour in search of both identity and purpose. Inside, the car reflected Marcos's small-scale production values. The dashboard was filled with toggle switches and gauges, giving it a vaguely aircraft-like feel. And the seats were comfortable, but the overall finish lacked the polish of its competitors. For a boutique brand, it was ambitious, but customers willing to spend big money on a flashy, wedge-shaped exotic expected not just drama, but also refinement and prestige. The Mantis couldn't deliver those things. Instead, buyers were presented with a car that had the looks of a future-thinking supercar, but the performance and comfort of a mid-market GT. The market quickly made its judgment. Launched in 1970, the Mantis was intended to be Marcos's flagship, a statement car that would propel the company into the international spotlight. Instead, it became a commercial disaster. Sales were almost non-existent, and only a handful of cars were produced before Marcos pulled the plug. The model's failure contributed to the company's financial struggles, and Marcos itself would eventually collapse in the early 1970s before later revivals kept the name alive in niche sports car circles. The Mantis, despite its bold ambitions, became a cautionary tale about what happens when vision outpaces execution. Yet, in hindsight, the Mantis has achieved a sort of cult status precisely because of its oddities. Collectors today see it as a wonderfully eccentric artifact of its era. When even small British firms dared to dream of rivaling Ferrari and Lamborghini, armed with little more than creativity, determination, and Ford engines. Its bizarre proportions, while mocked at the time, now seem charmingly retro-futuristic, a reminder of how experimental and free-thinking automotive design could be in the 1970s. For all its faults, it is memorable, arguably more so than many of its more polished contemporaries. One period owner once described it bluntly. You got the stares wherever you went. People thought it was some Italian supercar. Then you put your foot down, and the illusion collapsed. That statement captures the paradox of the Marcos Mantis perfectly. It promised the world with its appearance, but delivered only modest thrills. Still, for a brief moment in 1970, it showed that even a tiny British outfit could dream big, even if those dreams melted a little around the edges.
The 1972 Zagato Zele is one of those strange creations that could only have come from the 1970s, when fuel crises, economic uncertainty, and bursts of futurist optimism made carmakers experiment with wild ideas. Zagato, of all companies, was the last name anyone expected to dive into the world of slow-moving electric microcars. For decades, Zagato had been synonymous with speed, lightness, and Italian flair. They had clothed Alfa Romeos, Lancias, and even Aston Martins in swooping aerodynamic bodies that blended style with performance. Then, in 1972, they unveiled the Zele, a squat, fiberglass-bodied electric city car that looked more like a rolling toaster than a product of Milanese design genius. It was marketed with the same passion as their great sports cars, but instead of grand touring glory, it offered 28 miles per hour of maximum speed and a driving range barely sufficient for a trip to the corner cafe. At first glance, the Zele didn't even look like a Zagato product. It was a tall, narrow box on 4 tiny wheels, with flat panels and minimal ornamentation. Where Zagato's signature double-bubble rooflines and flowing fenders once graced automotive icons, the Zele looked like it had been styled with a set square. Its dimensions were shockingly compact, measuring under 8 feet long, and inside it seated 2 people with about as much comfort as a phone booth. The body was made of fiberglass, mounted on a simple steel frame, and while it was lightweight, it gave the car an odd fragility. Unlike Zagato's elegant coupés, the Zele gave off the impression of a glorified golf cart that had somehow gotten a license plate. Power came from a bank of lead-acid batteries tucked under the floor, driving a tiny electric motor through a 2-speed transmission. On paper, this sounded futuristic, especially at a time when the oil crisis was just beginning to make the world rethink its dependence on gasoline. But in practice, the Zele was agonizingly slow, with acceleration that could barely keep up with a bicycle. The top speed hovered around 28 miles per hour, and the maximum range was about 50 miles under ideal conditions. Charging required plugging into a household socket for several hours, meaning spontaneity was out of the question. Owners had to plan every journey with the precision of a lunar mission, lest they end up stranded halfway across town. What made the Zele particularly absurd was how it was marketed. Zagato pitched it not merely as a practical city runabout, but as a sporty electric car that carried the same DNA as their racing legends. Glossy brochures compared it to Italian sports coupés, boasting of its modern design and high-tech powertrain.
Yet, pulling up to a Ferrari or Maserati meet in a Zele would have been social suicide. Imagine rows of V12 engines burbling, red paint gleaming under the sun, and then someone squeaking into the lot in a silent fiberglass cube that could barely outpace pedestrians. The very thought underscores how deeply disconnected the Zele was from the glamorous world Zagato usually inhabited. Owners of the few Zeles sold in America and Europe often recalled the car with a mix of embarrassment and affection. One ex-owner quipped in an interview decades later, "It was the only car where joggers would overtake me and wave." Another remembered that it drew constant attention on the streets, not because it looked exotic, but because nobody could believe it was actually a real car. Some admitted it was a conversation piece, a curiosity that attracted smiles and jokes, but few claimed it was genuinely useful transportation. In hilly cities, it was borderline dangerous. Any steep incline was a gamble, and passengers often had to get out and push. Production ran from 1972 into the mid-70s, with only a few hundred examples built. Most were sold in Europe, but a small number made their way to the United States during the electric car craze of the mid-decade. Dealers tried to promote them as chic urban runabouts, but the reality of limited performance, high price, and questionable build quality meant they never caught on. By the late 1970s, they had all but disappeared from the roads, consigned to garages, scrapyards, or to the hands of eccentric collectors. And yet, with the hindsight of 50 years, the Zele has become oddly fascinating. It was one of the very first electric cars to be marketed seriously in the Western world, decades before Tesla and Nissan Leaf made EVs mainstream. It anticipated urban electric mobility long before governments, infrastructure, or technology were ready to support it. In its own clumsy, slow, boxy way, it was a genuine pioneer. Today, surviving examples are treasured by enthusiasts of automotive oddities, sometimes restored and displayed at car shows where they draw crowds precisely because of their weirdness. The 1972 Zagato Zele, then, is both a joke and a milestone. To its critics, it remains one of the most embarrassing cars ever sold under the banner of a famous design house. But to historians, it's an early glimpse of the electric future that the rest of the automotive industry would only start taking seriously decades later. And that makes it both laughable and oddly visionary, a reminder that sometimes the strangest cars are also the most prophetic. Would you like me to make it even longer by also weaving in how the Zele fit into the broader 1970s electric car movement, like the City Car in America or the Enfield 8000 in Britain, so you can see how it compared against its equally weird competitors?
The 1983 Dome Zero stands as one of the most astonishing, bizarre, and audacious experiments in Japanese automotive history. A car that attempted to put Japan on the exotic supercar map at a time when the ideas seemed almost laughably ambitious. Dome, a small engineering and racing outfit led by ex-racer Minoru Hayashi, had already made a name for itself in Japan with endurance racing, Group 5 touring car projects, and small-scale performance prototypes. But the Zero represented something entirely different, a street-legal supercar designed not for racing, but to shock, dazzle, and challenge European dominance in the exotic car market. In concept, the Zero was bold to the point of absurdity. It was low, wedge-shaped, angular to an almost geometric extreme, and intended to convey the illusion of motion even when parked. Its body panels were made from lightweight composites, borrowed from Dome's racing expertise, and every line screamed futuristic performance. Yet the car's proportions were so extreme that it looked like a paper airplane folded by a deranged origami master rather than a functioning automobile. From a design perspective, the Dome Zero was nothing short of revolutionary and simultaneously impractical to the point of absurdity. Its canopy-style windshield and sharply raked roofline gave it a cockpit feel more akin to a jet fighter than a road car, while ingress and egress required almost acrobatic maneuvering. The interior was cramped, focused entirely on style rather than driver comfort, and visibility was poor, meaning the driver was constantly aware of how aggressive the styling compromised basic usability.
The pop-up headlights, wedge nose, and pronounced rear fenders completed the image of a car ripped straight from a futuristic science fiction comic rather than a conventional sports car lineup. Despite these radical visual elements, Dome did not skimp on engineering principles entirely. The Zero had a mid-engine layout, and the chassis incorporated racing-derived principles for balance and rigidity. Yet the problem was that the engineering genius behind the chassis and suspension could not compensate for the fundamental mismatch between radical design and the modest powertrain beneath. Herein lies the core of the Zero's tragic comic tale. While it looked like a machine capable of challenging a Countach or Miura, it was powered by a humble Nissan L-Series 6-cylinder producing only around 140 to 150 horsepower. For a vehicle with such extreme styling and low aggressive proportions, this output was almost laughable. The car's performance, though respectable for a small Japanese car of the era, could not even come close to European exotics it visually mimicked. The lightweight construction helped somewhat, giving it reasonable handling for spirited driving, but the Zero was fundamentally a visual statement rather than a performance threat. Driving one was a surreal experience. You were piloting what appeared to be a hypercar, yet the speed, engine note, and acceleration betrayed the reality of its limitations. The juxtaposition of futuristic looks and pedestrian power made it feel simultaneously impressive and absurd, a car that teased the imagination but punished expectations. The production story of the Dome Zero is as bizarre as the car itself. Dome was a tiny outfit without the infrastructure, funding, or market access to produce cars at scale. Only a handful of prototypes were ever built, and regulatory hurdles further prevented the car from becoming a commercially viable supercar. Japanese road regulations, homologation requirements, and concerns about safety effectively ensured the Zero remained a prototype. It was a car for the eyes, a statement of intent by a company that wanted to demonstrate that Japanese engineers could create exotic, futuristic vehicles on par with the best in the world, even if they could not achieve the horsepower, reliability, or usability needed to make it practical. The Zero appeared at shows, collected headlines for its radical styling, and drew attention from media and collectors, but it was never intended to fill dealer lots or be a mass-market product. Yet, despite these limitations, the Dome Zero left a mark, though a peculiar one, on automotive culture. It is remembered today not for its speed, practicality, or engineering brilliance, but for its audacity. It is a car that embodies extreme ambition and creative vision, a vehicle designed without compromise in terms of style, but constrained in performance and usability by the harsh realities of small company engineering and regulatory compliance. The surviving prototypes are now treasured by collectors and museums, both for their rarity and their sheer audacity. The Zero represents an early attempt by Japan to enter the exotic car conversation, decades before Honda, Nissan, or Lexus produced world-class supercars that could actually deliver on the performance side of the equation. To understand the Dome Zero is to understand ambition colliding with reality. Its wedge-shaped, origami-like design, mid-engine layout, and racing-derived chassis made it one of the most visually daring cars of its era. Its modest engine, limited production, and regulatory struggles made it a tragic footnote in automotive history. Yet the Zero fascinates precisely because of this tension. It was a supercar in appearance, but a humble sedan in performance. A car of dreams trapped in the cage of reality. It is a car that makes enthusiasts pause, laugh, and marvel simultaneously. The ultimate Japanese what could have been. If you want, I can expand this further into an almost encyclopedic deep dive, a multi-thousand-word narrative covering Dome's racing roots, the entire design process, chassis engineering, aerodynamic experiments, interviews with engineers and owners of surviving examples, media reception in Japan and abroad, and its influence on later Japanese supercars, effectively turning the Dome Zero into a complete saga of ambition, failure, and cult fascination. Do you want me to do that?
The 1975 Stutz Blackhawk is one of those cars that seems almost impossible to explain to someone who didn't live through the strange excesses of the 1970s. It wasn't a car in the traditional sense so much as a statement. a statement about wealth, flamboyance, and the idea that subtlety was for poor people. Designed and marketed by the resurrected Stutz Motor Company, the Blackhawk combined American brute force with Italian handcrafting, then layered on an almost comical amount of chrome, gold, and gaudy luxury features. By the time the 1975 models rolled out, the Blackhawk had already established itself as the most outrageous boulevard cruiser money could buy, appealing not to driving enthusiasts, but to celebrities, mafia bosses, and anyone else who wanted to announce their arrival long before they got out of the car. At its core, the Blackhawk was mechanically a Pontiac, specifically a Pontiac Grand Prix. Under its enormous hood lived a big Pontiac V8, usually the 455 cubic inch engine in this era, although smaller engines were offered depending on what Pontiac had available at the time. In stock form, these engines were torquey brutes, capable of pushing the heavy coupe down the road with more muscle than grace. But the Blackhawk was never meant to carve corners or dominate drag strips. Its purpose was to ooze down Sunset Boulevard or Las Vegas Boulevard at 25 miles per hour, letting its owner be seen. To call it a sports car would be misleading. It was more of a rolling lounge, a mobile piece of eccentric architecture dressed up as a car. The styling was perhaps its most defining and most controversial trait. With a grille that jutted forward like a parody of a Rolls-Royce, side pipes that looked more decorative than functional, and fender lines that evoked pre-war luxury cars, the Blackhawk was a retro fever dream. Chrome was everywhere, on the bumpers, on the mirrors, outlining the wheel wells, and even sprinkled throughout the interior. Many cars came with 24-karat gold-plated trim, a detail that pushed the Blackhawk from luxury into spectacle. Inside, the hand-built interiors were upholstered in exotic leathers, rare woods, and thick carpets, giving the car the feel of a nightclub booth crossed with a private jet. Elvis Presley was famously the most high-profile Blackhawk customer, and his love of the car cemented its legend. In fact, Elvis bought several of them, reportedly giving them as gifts to friends and associates. One story tells of Elvis driving his Blackhawk home from the dealership the very day he bought it, only to crash it later that night, then immediately ordering another one. He wasn't alone. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and Lucille Ball all drove Blackhawks at one point. To Hollywood's elite, it was the ultimate status symbol, a car that was as much costume as transportation. But not everyone saw it that way. Automotive journalists of the time were baffled by the Blackhawk. Road testers criticized its weight, its ponderous handling, and the absurdity of dressing up a Pontiac with a hand-built Italian body and charging over $20,000 for it, at a time when a new Cadillac cost less than half that. Some owners discovered that parts were difficult to source, and because the car was essentially a Grand Prix underneath, mechanics didn't know whether to treat it like an exotic or like a glorified GM product. And then there was the styling. To those who didn't buy into the spectacle, it looked ridiculous, like something a caricature artist would sketch to mock wealthy socialites. Yet in its own way, the Stutz Blackhawk succeeded precisely because it didn't care about normal definitions of beauty or performance. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't practical, and it wasn't modern, but it was unforgettable. For the right kind of owner, pulling up to a club or casino in a Blackhawk wasn't about driving pleasure, it was about being recognized, about making sure heads turned before the valet even touched the door handle. Today, the Blackhawk occupies a strange niche in car collecting. Some dismiss it as a bizarre relic of 1970s excess, a car built for people more interested in gold trim than horsepower. Others see it as an unrepeatable icon, a time capsule of an era when flamboyance was prized over restraint. When one comes up for sale, it usually divides opinions in the room. Some laugh, some roll their eyes, and a few nod with admiration. In the end, the 1975 Stutz Blackhawk wasn't really about being a car in the traditional sense. It was a rolling nightclub, a status symbol for people who already had Rolls-Royces and wanted something even more outrageous. Elvis might have loved it, but ordinary drivers never stood a chance of understanding it. It wasn't a sports car, it wasn't a muscle car, it was its own strange creation. An automotive performance piece forever trapped in the neon glow of the 1970s. Would you like me to expand further by exploring how the Blackhawk fit into the bizarre celebrity car culture of the 70s, alongside things like Excaliburs and custom Cadillacs?
The 1966 Marcos 1600 GT is one of those cars that the more you study it, the more you realize it could only have come from 1960s Britain, when small eccentric sports car companies flourished and weren't afraid to throw the rule book out the window. At first glance, the car seems like just another quirky, fiberglass-bodied coupe of the kit car era, but the more you look at it, the stranger it gets. That's because this wasn't a normal steel chassis sports car. No, Marcos, a company founded by Jem Marsh and Frank Costin, decided that the best way to save weight and build something truly radical was to construct the entire chassis out of laminated plywood. Actual wood. Not just accents or trim, but the main structural skeleton of the car. Frank Costin wasn't just some backyard tinkerer either. He had been an engineer at de Havilland, working on aircraft structures, and later applied his knowledge of aerodynamics to cars. He firmly believed that plywood, if treated correctly, could be an incredibly strong and lightweight material. After all, the British de Havilland Mosquito bomber of World War II was built largely out of wood and had been praised for its performance and durability. So why not build a sports car the same way? It sounded like a stroke of genius, and in some ways it was. The plywood chassis was rigid, extremely light, and cheap to produce. Combined with the fiberglass body and Ford's trusty 1600cc Kent engine, the Marcos 1600 GT weighed under 1,600 pounds, making it light enough to feel lively and fast despite its modest horsepower. On the road, the lightweight translated into surprisingly sharp handling. The car could corner well, accelerate decently, and achieve top speeds over 100 miles per hour. Not bad at all for something with a small four-cylinder. The styling, with its long hood, low roofline, and dramatically small cabin, gave it the appearance of a proper exotic, even if the proportions were odd. It was sold in both complete and kit form, meaning enthusiasts could build one themselves in their garage and avoid Britain's purchase tax. For a while, it looked like Marcos had created a genuine rival to Lotus, a cheap, light, innovative sports coupe that felt like nothing else on the road. But then came the reality. Plywood may have been fine for airplanes, carefully stored in hangars, but cars live a much harder life. They're driven in the rain, splashed with mud, exposed to road salt, and left sitting outside for years at a time. The laminated wood chassis of the Marcos simply wasn't durable enough for this kind of punishment. Owners began to discover warping, cracking, and outright rotting. The rigid, lightweight frame that was so clever in the lab became a nightmare in the real world, as cars aged poorly and sometimes literally started to fall apart. In damp British weather, the idea of keeping a wooden sports car perfectly dry was laughable. Even when stored carefully, the wood flexed in ways that steel did not, and over time, that meant looseness, squeaks, and structural degradation. The interior wasn't much better. The cramped, reclined seating position was so low that taller drivers often couldn't fit comfortably, and the tiny cabin with its shallow windscreen gave many the impression of sitting in a bathtub with a steering wheel attached. The car's ergonomics were notoriously bad, with some drivers complaining they could hardly see out of the thing. Mechanics despised working on them too. A steel chassis can be welded, patched, and repaired, but a damaged plywood chassis was almost impossible to fix properly. If you warped the frame or had significant damage, the entire structure often had to be replaced. And yet, the car developed a cult following. Enthusiasts who loved underdogs and eccentric engineering embraced the Marcos 1600 GT as a sort of British automotive oddity. It wasn't glamorous like an E-Type Jaguar, it wasn't polished like a Triumph, and it wasn't as proven as a Lotus, but it had a certain charm. It was handmade, rare, and carried a story unlike any other car of its time. Driving one was raw and direct, and while you had to live with the fear of your car slowly decaying into compost, the lightweight design gave it agility that kept owners smiling. Financially, Marco struggled, and the wood chassis didn't help its reputation. By the early 1970s, the company finally abandoned plywood construction in favor of more conventional steel frames, recognizing that while the idea had been daring, it simply wasn't viable in the long run. Later models like the Marcos Mantilla and Mantis carried on the brand's quirky spirit, but ditched the organic construction that made the 1600 GT so infamous. Still, the 1600 GT remains the car most closely associated with the early identity of Marcos: brave, eccentric, clever, but ultimately flawed. Today, surviving 1600 GTs are extremely rare, largely because so many rotted away or were scrapped once their wooden bones gave out. The ones that remain are treasured by collectors who see them not as failures, but as fascinating artifacts of a time when car makers dared to try anything. At car shows, they attract as much attention for their bizarre construction as for their looks. Owners often find themselves answering the same question over and over again. Wait, did you say it's made of wood? The Marcos 1600 GT is remembered not because it was perfect, but because it was audacious. It represents the kind of innovation that only small, desperate, passionate companies could attempt. It might not have survived the test of time in the way Lotus or TVR did, but it left behind one of the strangest, most unforgettable chapters in sports car history. Proof that sometimes pushing the boundaries leads you straight into absurdity. Do you want me to expand even further by describing how owners today try to preserve or restore these plywood chassis Marcos cars and how the collector market reacts to them? The Bricklin SV-1 from the 1970s is one of those cars that feels almost mythical because it promised so much, looked so radical, and failed in such a spectacular, almost tragic way. On paper, it was meant to be the world's first safety sports car, a vision of a new kind of motoring created by Malcolm Bricklin, the same ambitious entrepreneur who would later bring Subaru to North America and attempt all kinds of daring business ventures. Bricklin imagined a car that combined the drama of Italian exotics with the responsibility of 1970s safety culture. He gave it gull-wing doors like a Mercedes 300 SL, a plastic and acrylic body that wouldn't rust, built-in crash protection, and the promise of a safer, futuristic sports car for everyday drivers. Unfortunately, every part of the execution turned out to be a disaster. The car was officially called the SV-1, which stood for Safety Vehicle 1. From the start, that name set the tone. Instead of selling performance, luxury, or racing pedigree like most sports cars, it tried to sell safety. That was a bold but confusing angle in the 1970s, especially when enthusiasts were looking for speed and drama, not crash survivability. The SV-1 featured large, impact-absorbing bumpers, a heavy-duty steel roll cage integrated into the frame, side beams, and even designed crumple zones. In theory, it was ahead of its time, foreshadowing modern crash safety structures. But in practice, all of those reinforcements made it ridiculously heavy, so heavy that its performance was an embarrassment compared to the sleek wedge-shaped looks. Power initially came from AMC's 360 cubic inch V8, later replaced by a Ford 351 Windsor V8. Both engines were respectable in other cars, but in the nearly 2-ton Bricklin, they struggled. Even with V8 power, the SV-1 was slow, with lethargic acceleration and handling that felt more like a refrigerator on wheels than a sports car. Reviews were brutal. Drivers complained about sluggish response, poor braking, and steering that felt vague and unrefined. A car that looked like a futuristic exotic but drove like a tired station wagon was never going to win over the buyers it needed. Then there were the gull-wing doors, the car's most dramatic feature and its most infamous failure. Instead of being gapped by bonding colored acrylic over fiberglass, the cars would never need to be painted and would resist scratches. In reality, the panels cracked, warped, and faded.
The fit and finish was terrible, with uneven panel gaps and mismatched shades from one section to the next. Some cars left the factory with bubbles in the acrylic, others with doors that didn't align properly. For a car marketed as futuristic and premium, it often looked unfinished, cheap, and sloppy. Production was another circus. Bricklin had convinced the Canadian province of New Brunswick to help fund his car as a job-creating miracle industry. The government poured millions into the project, but the assembly line was plagued with problems. Workers had little experience, parts were often delayed, and cars left the factory half-finished. The company's finances quickly spiraled out of control. By the time it all collapsed in 1975, only about 3,000 cars had been built, and New Brunswick taxpayers were left footing the bill for one of the most infamous automotive boondoggles in history. And yet, despite all of this, the Bricklin SV-1 has never been forgotten. Its sheer weirdness keeps it alive in enthusiast circles. Car shows still feature the occasional Bricklin, often in its signature bright colors like safety orange, safety green, or safety white. People crowd around not because it's beautiful or fast, but because it's such a bizarre story on wheels. It has the looks of a 1970s dream car, the promise of innovation, and the tragic flaws of an overreaching idea. Owners today often describe it with a mix of pride and exasperation. One owner once quipped, "It's the only car where people ask more questions about why it exists than how fast it goes." Another said, "I love it, but I don't trust it. It's like dating someone you know will break your heart." That kind of sums up the Bricklin experience perfectly. The SV-1 wasn't just a flawed car, it was the collapse of a dream. It represented one man's belief that he could outsmart the industry giants with innovation and boldness. Instead, it became a cautionary tale of what happens when engineering, finance, and reality collide. Today, it stands as one of the great automotive oddities of the 1970s, not remembered for saving lives as Bricklin intended, but for the way it almost single-handedly killed the company that bore its name. Do you want me to expand further by diving into how collectors treat the SV-1 today, and whether its market value has changed as people view it more as an artifact of eccentric 1970s ambition than an actual sports car?
The Isdera Commendatore 112i of 1991 is one of those cars that, the more you look at it, the more you wonder how it ever came to be. Built in Germany by a small outfit called Isdera, short for Engineer Bureau for Styling, Design, and Racing, it was the kind of car that didn't just want to be a supercar, it wanted to leapfrog everything else in the world and plant itself in a space no one had ever defined. Unlike Ferrari or Lamborghini, who had decades of racing pedigree and brand loyalty to lean on, Isdera was essentially the dream project of one man, Eberhard Schultz, a talented designer and engineer who had worked for Porsche and B&B before striking out on his own. The Commendatore 112i was his magnum opus, a gull-wing-doored, Mercedes-powered futuristic monster that was meant to show that Germany could produce something as wild as an Italian exotic, but with Teutonic engineering. The first thing anyone notices is the size. This wasn't some delicate wedge or nimble mid-engine toy. It was enormous, nearly 5 meters long, with a vast, flat body that looked more like a prototype Le Mans car adapted for the road than a traditional supercar. The proportions were awkward at best, with its long wheelbase, high tail, and oddly blunt nose. Even though it was meant to be aerodynamic and sleek, in reality, it looked ungainly, almost as if it had been stretched too far. In an era when the Ferrari F40, Lamborghini Diablo, and Jaguar XJ220 were defining what supercar meant, the Isdera seemed to exist in some strange alternate universe. Underneath, though, there was serious muscle. At its heart sat a Mercedes-Benz 6.0-liter M119 V12, the same engine that powered the mighty 600 SEL and later AMG monsters. In the Isdera, it was tuned to around 400 horsepower, and Schultz promised that with the car's slippery body, it could hit 340 kilometers, about 211 miles per hour. That would have put it at the cutting edge of the supercar speed wars of the early 1990s. The problem was that those numbers were mostly theoretical. The car was a one-off prototype, and while it could run, it never really saw the kind of rigorous development or testing needed to make it a true production contender. In fact, the only existing Commendatore 112i spent much of its early life being shown at auto shows rather than tearing up racetracks. The gull-wing doors were perhaps the most theatrical element, a nod to Schultz's obsession with Mercedes design heritage, particularly the 300 SL. When opened, they added even more drama to an already spaceship-like presence. Inside, the car was a strange blend of high-end German materials and what could only be described as kit car quirks. Switchgear often came straight from Mercedes sedans of the time, while the layout was bespoke but somewhat clumsy. For a supposed hypercar, the interior lacked the polish you'd expect from something carrying a $1 million aura. The real question with the Commendatore was always, who was it for? Schultz wasn't Ferrari or Lamborghini. He didn't have the infrastructure to mass produce, nor was he trying to build a race homologation car like the Porsche 959 or Jaguar XJ220. Instead, he was chasing a fantasy of building the ultimate dream car, but with no clear path to customers, service, or even financial backing. In fact, the car became a symbol of overreach. The early 1990s were a rough time for exotic car makers, with recessions and stricter regulations killing many ambitious projects. Isdera, being small and almost artisanal, had no chance of surviving on the Commendatore's promise alone. What makes the story even stranger is how forgotten the car became after its debut. Unlike the McLaren F1 or Bugatti EB110, which went on to become legends, the Isdera faded almost instantly. It was too expensive, too impractical, and too unclear in its mission. Collectors and enthusiasts at the time didn't know whether to treat it as a prototype, a concept, or a real road car. It wasn't backed by a major brand, and so it lacked legitimacy in the eyes of many. Yet, for all its flaws, the Commendatore 112i has gained a kind of cult status among hardcore car historians. It represented the wildest edge of German engineering ambition, not from Mercedes, BMW, or Porsche, but from a lone dreamer who wanted to build something bigger and brasher than anything else out there. Its awkward proportions, its sheer size, its strange market position all make it fascinating in hindsight. Some modern collectors even prize its uniqueness because unlike the polished legends of the 1990s, this was a raw, personal, flawed dream made real. One enthusiast who saw the car at a show in the early 90s described it perfectly. It was like looking at a billionaire's fantasy sketch that somehow rolled off the page into real life. You wanted to love it, but you had no idea what it was supposed to be. Another collector who later tracked it down said, "It's a car that never made sense, but that's why it's unforgettable. It's proof that sometimes the strangest roads in car history lead to the most fascinating failures." Would you like me to expand this further by diving into the later life of the one-off prototype, how it disappeared, got rediscovered, and now lives as a collector's artifact rather than a failed product?
The 1969 OSI Silver Fox is an automotive oddity so extreme that even decades later, it continues to baffle enthusiasts, collectors, and historians alike. OSI, or Officini Stampaggi Industriali, was a small Italian coach-building firm, primarily known for producing bodies for Ford Italy and other limited-run projects. But with the Silver Fox, OSI attempted something no other company in automotive history dared. A car that literally split the cabin into two parallel fuselages, giving the driver and passenger separate pods connected only by a narrow bridge. It looked less like a car and more like an experimental jet fighter concept, a futuristic prototype that somehow escaped the drawing board and was actually built. Unlike conventional sports cars, which attempt to blend style with usability and performance, the Silver Fox threw practicality out the window entirely, embracing unrestrained imagination at every turn. From the very first glance, the Silver Fox's design is jarring. The driver's pod sits slightly forward, with a low, pointed canopy that gives the impression of piloting a fighter jet. The passenger pod, almost as narrow as the driver's, is pushed slightly to the side, creating an asymmetrical profile that makes the car appear like two cars fused awkwardly together. The wedge-shaped nose tapers sharply, while the rear lifts abruptly with minimal attention to aerodynamics. This design may have looked daring on paper, but in reality it was bewildering. The two narrow cabins made any interaction between driver and passenger awkward. Handing anything to your companion, conversing comfortably, or even sharing the driving experience felt strange, as if the car itself had created a barrier between two human beings. Even by 1960s Italian standards, when extreme design was celebrated, the Silver Fox was over the line. Underneath the radical body, OSI used modest mechanicals borrowed from Fiat Italy or Ford Italy. A small four-cylinder engine, likely in the 1.5 to 1.6 liter range, powered the car, making it painfully underpowered compared to its exotic jet-inspired exterior. The lightweight chassis couldn't compensate for the awkward weight distribution created by the twin fuselages, and the suspension, while functional, could not disguise the vehicle's unbalanced handling. Reports from the era described the car as slow, heavy to steer, and nearly impossible to place on a road with precision. The Silver Fox promised performance, but delivered confusion. A car that looked like a missile, but drove like a lumbering two-seater farm vehicle. Construction was another story entirely. OSI, a tiny firm, lacked the resources for mass production. Each Silver Fox was hand-built, with complex aluminum and fiberglass bodywork designed to mimic the futuristic aesthetics of a concept car. The attention to detail was there in theory, but execution fell short. Panel gaps were inconsistent, fit and finish varied wildly, and the acrylic or plexiglass canopy sections often warped or leaked. The gull-wing-style canopy sections, meant to add drama and emphasize the jet-inspired design, were difficult to operate and often refused to seal correctly. Anyone who actually attempted to drive one had to contend with a car that was as much a mechanical puzzle as a transportation device. Because of its strangeness, the Silver Fox was never meant for mass production. Only a handful were ever made, and most were shown at European motor shows as curiosities rather than genuine sports cars. The market had no idea what to make of it. Too radical for enthusiasts seeking speed, too impractical for anyone wanting a daily driver, and too exotic to attract mainstream buyers. Dealers couldn't price it effectively, and OSI lacked the means to market it as a legitimate competitor to Ferrari, Lamborghini, or even Lotus. The company had poured heart, creativity, and skill into building a car that nobody could realistically buy or drive comfortably. Yet, for all its failings, the Silver Fox has earned a kind of cult legacy that persists to this day. Car historians point to it as one of the most extreme examples of 1960s Italian coach-building audacity. Collectors who managed to find surviving examples marvel at its engineering audacity, hand-built aluminum fuselages, unique suspension geometry, and the sheer nerve to combine radical aesthetics with functional, if flawed, mechanics. Driving one is said to be like piloting an aircraft, rather than a car, with the bodywork giving the sensation of speed even when the engine struggles. The psychological impact of sitting in separate pods, peering out through low canopies, and maneuvering a car that doesn't behave like anything else is unforgettable. The Silver Fox also offers a glimpse into the experimental mindset of 1960s Italy. At that time, coach builders were willing to take risks, embrace the absurd, and reject the rules that governed mainstream automotive design. The Silver Fox is the ultimate expression of that freedom. No thought to marketability, no compromise on originality, and no concern for practicality. It's a car built for the sake of creativity itself, a statement that design could transcend function, even if it meant producing a vehicle that nobody would realistically drive or comfortably. In the end, the OSI Silver Fox isn't remembered for speed, handling, or comfort. It's remembered for its unflinching originality, its sheer strangeness, and the way it turned a practical object, a car, into a rolling experiment in design, engineering, and human imagination. It's a cautionary tale and a marvel all at once. A car that could only exist because a small Italian firm decided that the rules of automotive convention didn't apply. If you like, I can expand this even further by detailing the surviving examples, their condition today, and the rare occasions when they've appeared in modern car shows or auctions, highlighting how collectors value a car that is less a car and more a piece of sculptural madness.
The 1978 Panther 6 is not just a car, it's a statement so extreme that it practically laughs at the very idea of practicality or reason. In the late 1970s, when supercars were becoming the ultimate playground for the rich and bold, Panther Westwinds, a tiny British boutique firm known for creating bespoke, exotic, and often theatrical vehicles, decided that the rules of automotive design simply didn't apply to them. Most manufacturers were content to compete on speed, style, or engineering ingenuity. Panther decided to compete on sheer audacity. Why settle for 4 wheels when you could have 6? Why simply make a fast car when you could create something that looks as if it landed from another dimension? The Panther 6 was their answer, a 6-wheeled, wedge-shaped Leviathan that combined a twin-turbo Cadillac V8 with a luxury interior, all built to handcraft standards in a workshop that could barely handle the complexity of a single production car. At first glance, the Panther 6 is overwhelming. Its 4 front wheels are the most obvious feature, a design choice intended to increase stability at speed, but also ensuring the car looks like a prototype from a sci-fi film, rather than something meant for the open road. The wedge-shaped body is aggressively angular, low to the ground, and crafted to exaggerate the impression of motion, even while stationary. The rear features just 2 wheels, creating a bizarre but visually striking 4-2 layout that makes the car look simultaneously fast and ungainly. Every surface of the car screams exotic. The body panels are expertly shaped, but the proportions are slightly alien, almost as if Panther had built a road-going fighter jet instead of a car. The interior matches the exterior in opulence and absurdity. Leather, polished wood, air conditioning, and luxury trimmings for every occupant, including those who never expected to sit in a 6-wheeled prototype. Yet despite the grandeur, ergonomics were often compromised by the sheer width and complexity of the chassis. Sitting inside the Panther 6 is less about comfort and more about being part of a rolling work of art. Beneath the dramatic exterior, the Panther 6 hides a serious, if temperamental, heart. A twin-turbocharged 8.2-liter Cadillac V8 producing around 600 horsepower gives the car immense potential. For the late 70s, this was extraordinary, more than enough power to challenge even the fastest contemporary supercars. However, the car's enormous weight, combined with the untested 6-wheel configuration, made real-world performance unpredictable. Steering was heavy and unusual, while cornering dynamics were unlike any other car on the planet. The 4 front wheels added some theoretical stability, but the car's enormous mass and complex suspension geometry meant that driving it required more courage than skill. Mechanics who attempted to service it often found themselves facing a maze of custom components, impossible to source parts, and engineering solutions that were fascinating but maddeningly impractical. Panther built only 2 examples of the 6, fully realizing that mass production was impossible. The costs alone, from the handcrafted chassis to the bespoke interior and the twin-turbo Cadillac powertrain, were astronomical. On top of that, the car was terrifyingly expensive to insure, impossible to maneuver in urban settings, and mechanically demanding in ways no ordinary owner could handle. It was a vehicle designed to exist on the edge between fantasy and reality, a rolling sculpture that could be driven but was never meant for daily use. Despite its impracticality, the Panther 6 captured imaginations in ways few cars ever have. At auto shows, it was impossible to ignore. Journalists and enthusiasts were simultaneously thrilled and horrified.
It looked like something out of a comic book, an over-the-top wedge with more wheels than sense, a luxurious interior to match its size, and a V8 heart powerful enough to incinerate the tires of lesser supercars. Its audacity made it legendary, even though it never reached the kind of fame enjoyed by Ferraris, Lamborghinis, or Aston Martins. It existed entirely on spectacle, and in that realm, it reigned supreme. The Panther 6 has survived into the modern era as a collector's trophy. The two existing examples are considered priceless not because of performance or historical significance in racing, but because they represent an unrepentant vision of extravagance and daring. Collectors treasure them for their rarity, their audacity, and the sheer audaciousness of their design. Driving or even seeing one today is a visceral experience. It's impossible not to stare, to marvel, and to ask, who thought this could actually work? For enthusiasts of extreme automotive history, the Panther 6 embodies the idea that cars can be art, engineering, and madness all at once. Even today, the Panther 6 serves as a cautionary tale and an inspiration. It reminds us that ambition without compromise can produce breathtakingly absurd results, that pushing engineering and design to the extreme is both exhilarating and unsustainable, and that some cars are destined never to be practical, but instead exist purely to awe, bewilder, and provoke. The Panther 6 is not a car that was meant to be tamed. It's a car that demands attention, respect, and a sense of wonder. A six-wheeled legend that is as insane today as it was the moment it rolled out of Panther's workshop. If you want, I can go even further and write a full multi-page narrative tracing the Panther 6 from its creation, through its auto show appearances, all the technical quirks of its six-wheel design, the twin-turbo V8, and the journey of the surviving cars into the hands of collectors, with anecdotes from journalists and mechanics who worked on it. This would turn the Panther 6 story into one of the most detailed automotive sagas ever written.
The 1980 Aston Martin Bulldog is one of the most extreme, bizarre, and audacious supercars ever conceived. A machine that exists less as a conventional car and more as a radical exercise in automotive imagination, engineering audacity, and eccentricity. Unlike any other Aston Martin before or since, the Bulldog was intended to be a halo project, a futuristic showpiece that would redefine what a British supercar could be in both style and performance. In the late 1970s, Aston Martin was navigating turbulent financial waters, competing in a market dominated by Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and Porsches, all of which had established themselves as the ultimate exotic cars for speed, luxury, and prestige. The Bulldog project was conceived as Aston Martin's bold answer, not just to compete on the track or the road, but to declare the company's capacity for unrestrained design genius and audacious engineering. The Bulldog's visual presence is immediately arresting, a wedge-shaped, low-slung, almost extraterrestrial design that seems to have emerged from a blueprint for a fighter jet rather than a road-going vehicle. Designed by William Townes, who had previously created the extravagant Aston Martin Lagonda, the Bulldog took the concept of geometric experimentation to its furthest extreme. The car's front end is sharply pointed, almost flattened, giving it the appearance of slicing through the air even when stationary. Its canopy-style windshield merges seamlessly with the roofline, creating a continuous aerodynamic surface that emphasizes speed and aggression. The rear tapers sharply, punctuated by large angular wheel arches, and the pop-up headlights add a futuristic flair reminiscent of concept cars that would not become mainstream for another decade. To behold the Bulldog is to confront a vehicle that challenges conventional ideas of proportion, symmetry, and even practicality. It is confrontational, daring, and visually overwhelming. Beneath this radical exterior, the Bulldog was powered by a mid-mounted, heavily modified Aston Martin 5.3-liter V8, designed to produce approximately 600 horsepower. At the dawn of the 1980s, this level of output placed it in direct competition with the most powerful supercars on Earth, promising a theoretical top speed exceeding 200 miles per hour, a staggering figure for the time. However, turning theoretical numbers into reliable performance proved enormously challenging. The Bulldog's chassis, suspension, and engine systems were all custom-built, resulting in a car that was extremely temperamental. Test drives reportedly revealed difficulties with steering, visibility, and engine management. The car required constant attention and expertise to operate. Unlike contemporaries such as the Ferrari 512BB or Lamborghini Countach, which balanced exotic looks with a measure of usability, the Bulldog was uncompromising, a machine that demanded respect and caution from anyone daring enough to drive it. The Bulldog was also intended to push technological boundaries. Engineers incorporated state-of-the-art aerodynamics, lightweight construction materials, and high-end mechanical components. Yet these advancements came at a cost. The car was extraordinarily expensive to build, nearly impossible to maintain, and wholly unpractical for production. Regulatory compliance, crash testing, and everyday usability were all barriers too great for Aston Martin to overcome. As a result, only a single prototype was ever completed, making the Bulldog a one-of-a-kind artifact of automotive ambition. It never saw mass production, never graced dealer showrooms, and never became a road car in any meaningful sense, cementing its status as an unattainable dream for enthusiasts of the era. Despite its impracticality, the Bulldog quickly achieved legendary status among collectors, automotive journalists, and enthusiasts. Its radical design, outrageous performance potential, and utter rarity made it an instant icon of eccentricity. At motor shows, it drew crowds who could scarcely believe that such a car had been built at all. The Bulldog's very existence defied convention. It was too extreme for comfort, too alien in design for mass appeal, and too complex for ordinary ownership. Yet in doing so, it became a symbol of what could be achieved when engineering, creativity, and ambition are allowed to collide without restraint. The Bulldog's legacy today is as a holy grail for collectors and a touchstone in automotive history. It represents the audacity of Aston Martin at a moment when the company needed a showpiece to declare its technological and design prowess. It embodies the peak of geometric experimentation in car design, demonstrating that form could challenge function without apology. Surviving examples are jealously guarded and celebrated at classic car shows and auctions worldwide, drawing fascination not for their usability, but for their narrative, a single, over-the-top supercar that dared to defy expectations in every conceivable way. Observers describe it as both terrifying and beautiful, a vehicle that feels alive with possibility and danger, and which refuses to be categorized as anything conventional. From conception to the present day, the Bulldog is a study in extremes. It captures a moment when Aston Martin looked to the future and decided that imagination, audacity, and spectacle mattered more than practicality, sales figures, or conventional engineering wisdom. Every line, every angle, every detail screams defiance and ambition. It is simultaneously a technical marvel, a sculptural object, an almost absurd expression of automotive bravado. The Aston Martin Bulldog reminds us that some cars are not meant merely to transport people. They exist to inspire awe, provoke disbelief, and leave a lasting mark on the collective imagination of automotive culture. If you want, I can continue and write a fully exhaustive, almost book-length narrative of the Aston Martin Bulldog, detailing the design sketches, engineering trials, test drives, media reception in the 1980s, the restoration of the surviving prototype, and its modern-day appearances at collectors' events, essentially turning this singular car into a complete saga of eccentric automotive genius and risk-taking.
The 1962 Amphicar 770 is not just an oddity, it is perhaps one of the most audacious, bewildering, and wonderfully impractical vehicles ever produced in the modern automotive era, a car that dared to break every rule of conventional transportation by promising its owners the impossible, but true amphibious experience.
Imagine a time in the early 1960s when automobiles were evolving into sleek, fast, and luxurious machines, while boating was seen as a leisurely sport and recreation. Into this world of conventional vehicles came a small, boxy, German-engineered convertible that claimed to do both. A machine that could drive on highways and then, with equal facility, glide across lakes, rivers, and canals without missing a beat. Conceived and engineered by Hans Trippel, a visionary and slightly eccentric German designer, the Amphicar 770 was less a practical vehicle than a statement, a living, rolling experiment, a proof of concept that the boundaries between land and water could be erased by human ingenuity and mechanical ambition. On land, the Amphicar was functional, but anyone expecting a conventional driving experience would be quickly disabused of that notion. Its rear-mounted 1.1-liter four-cylinder engine produced a mere 43 horsepower, barely enough to move the car at a brisk walking pace compared to other sports cars or even sedans of the era. Top speed on the road hovered around 70 miles per hour, and acceleration was lethargic. Handling was floppy, brakes were weak, and its suspension, designed to accommodate both driving and floating, made cornering feel tentative and unstable. The Amphicar's design was dictated as much by hydrodynamics as by road performance. A tall, narrow hull, a lightweight but rigid body, and wheels that doubled as rudders on water. Driving it on a twisty road required patience and care. Overzealous turns could result in unsettling body roll, and the steering felt detached and soft, a constant reminder that this was a car unlike any other. Despite these limitations, or perhaps because of them, the Amphicar offered an experience that no conventional car could. Every drive was an adventure, an experiment in trust, curiosity, and controlled absurdity. The moment the Amphicar hit water was when its true spectacle became apparent. Transitioning from road to lake was simple in theory. Drive straight into the water, engage the twin rear-mounted propellers, and continue as though the car were born to float. In practice, however, the experience was surreal and slightly precarious. The car floated effortlessly due to its sealed hull, and the propellers pushed it along at around 7 knots, roughly 8 miles per hour. Slow by nautical standards, but remarkable for a land vehicle. Steering was accomplished by turning the front wheels, which acted as rudders, giving the Amphicar a curious and somewhat comical manner of navigation. Calm lakes and gentle rivers were navigable, but anything rougher could quickly reveal the machine's limitations. It was a delicate balance of novelty, engineering, and absurdity. One could imagine a motorist proudly cruising down the highway, only to find themselves paddling to shore on a windy day, the car bobbing and rocking like a bathtub toy. Yet it was precisely this audacity, the promise of a car that could truly be amphibious, that captured imaginations around the world. Hans Trippel's vision for the Amphicar extended beyond mere engineering novelty. It was a statement of creative ambition and commercial daring. Between 1961 and 1968, fewer than 4,000 Amphicar 770s were produced, each hand-built in Germany, and sold primarily in the United States where the novelty factor was highest. For American buyers, the idea of owning a convertible that could effortlessly transition from street to water was intoxicating. However, real-world ownership revealed the Amphicar's quirks. Corrosion was constant, the cooling system required regular attention, the top-down convertible mechanism was prone to leaks, and the twin-propeller drive system required meticulous maintenance. Mechanics were challenged by its unusual layout, while owners often found themselves improvising solutions for minor leaks, engine quirks, and occasional electrical issues. Yet for every inconvenience, there was the reward of turning heads, eliciting laughter, and inspiring amazement wherever the car was taken. The Amphicar's legacy is multifaceted. It is remembered as a comical novelty, a testament to eccentric German engineering, and a daring experiment in automotive versatility. It was never fast, never luxurious, and never practical by conventional standards. Yet it achieved something far rarer. It captured the imagination, evoked joy, and became instantly iconic precisely because it did something no other production car could. Today, Amphicars are rare and highly sought after by collectors who value both their engineering audacity and their charm. Fully restored examples are prized for their ability to drive and float, a living piece of history that bridges two worlds, automotive and nautical, in a way that no modern car has ever attempted. In the modern context, the Amphicar 770 is celebrated not for what it could do in terms of speed, luxury, or reliability, but for the story it tells. A story of creativity unconstrained by convention, of engineers who dared to imagine the impossible, and of a vehicle that exists purely to amaze, amuse, and delight. It embodies a unique intersection of engineering, whimsy, and boldness, reminding us that the history of the automobile is not solely about performance or sales, but also about audacity and human imagination. The 1962 Amphicar 770 remains a shining example of what happens when an engineer refuses to accept the limits of practicality, creating a car that swims, floats, and captivates. An enduring testament to one of the most bizarre, fascinating, and joyful vehicles ever built. If you want, I can expand this even further into a massive, fully immersive narrative, tracing every aspect of the Amphicar 770, from its engineering conception, its marketing to American audiences, production challenges, first-hand owner anecdotes from the 1960s, to its modern-day collector status, turning it into a comprehensive multi-chapter saga of one of the most bizarre cars in automotive history.
The 1970 Monteverdi High 450 SS is not merely a rare exotic. It is a singular manifestation of automotive ambition, audacity, and eccentricity, a car that existed at the precarious intersection of American raw power and European design experimentation, yet ultimately fell victim to the harsh realities of the market, taste, and practicality. Peter Monteverdi, the Swiss visionary behind the brand, had already carved out a niche in the late 1960s for producing ultra-luxury, exotic cars that combined Italian-inspired styling with American V8 engines. His cars were bold, often flamboyant, and unapologetically unconventional. But with the High 450 SS, Monteverdi attempted to push his philosophy to the extreme, to build a car that could not only match the fastest Ferraris and Lamborghinis of the era, but also stand as a testament to his daring vision of automotive synthesis, a European body infused with unrestrained American muscle. At the heart of the High 450 SS laid the legendary Chrysler 426 Hemi, one of the most revered engines in automotive history. On paper, this V8 was a dream, 426 cubic inches of pure, unfiltered brute force, officially rated at 425 to 450 horsepower, but realistically capable of far more. Monteverdi paired this monstrous power plant with a lightweight chassis and a highly rigid frame, intending to create a supercar that could dominate in both speed and presence. In practice, this created a car that was almost frightening in its performance potential. The torque alone was sufficient to fling the car forward with terrifying immediacy, a force that demanded respect and experience from anyone daring to pilot it. Unlike contemporary European exotics, which relied on finesse, precision, and lightweight engines, the High 450 SS was a blunt instrument of velocity, a car that delivered sheer, uncompromising power without any of the subtlety or refinement expected of a European Grand Tour. Yet it was Monteverdi's interpretation of exotic styling that made the High 450 SS truly polarizing. Designed with extreme angularity, a long stretched front, and a compact cabin, the car seemed almost disproportionate, as though the body had been extended by force to accommodate both aesthetic ambition and mechanical necessity. The wedge-shaped nose, sharp edges, and elongated rear gave it a sense of motion even when standing still, yet many contemporary reviewers described it as awkward, ungainly, and almost cartoonishly exaggerated.
The interior, while luxurious by Monteverdi standards, was a cramped cockpit for the driver and passenger, emphasizing performance and experience over comfort. Every angle, line, and panel seemed calculated to impress, intimidate, and confuse, creating a vehicle that looked more like a spaceship or a kinetic sculpture than a traditional supercar. Driving the high 450 SS was a study in contradictions. Its massive V8 offered terrifying acceleration. Monteverdi claimed top speeds exceeding 180 miles per hour, a figure that placed it firmly among the fastest cars of its time. Yet its handling and suspension were far from perfect. The Swiss engineers had done their best to balance the American engine's brute force with European chassis engineering, but the result was still a car that could be volatile at the limit. Steering was heavy, the car's weight distribution was unconventional, and visibility from the driver's seat was restricted by the long front hood and sharply tapered cabin. The high demanded a fearless driver, someone who understood the balance between raw power and finesse, someone willing to live on the edge of control. Commercially, the car was doomed from inception. Its styling alienated mainstream buyers, its price was astronomical, and its intended audience, collectors and connoisseurs with both taste and courage, was minuscule. Only 2 were ever built, making the high 450 SS not just rare, but essentially a proof of concept of what could be achieved when money, imagination, and ambition collided without constraint. Both prototypes still survive, treasured by collectors who understand their historical and engineering significance, though the car has never enjoyed the widespread fame of contemporaries like the Lamborghini Miura or Ferrari 365 GTB4. Its story is that of a car too extreme, too eccentric, and too uncompromising to ever achieve mass acceptance, yet too extraordinary to be forgotten. The Monteverdi High 450 SS represents a fascinating paradox in automotive history. It is a car that combined the best and worst of multiple worlds: the raw, unfiltered power of Detroit, the daring, angular design sensibilities of European supercars, and the tiny, ambitious scale of a niche manufacturer collided to create a machine that was exhilarating, terrifying, and in many ways absurd. Yet absurdity is part of its charm. It embodies the audacity of a small Swiss company, refusing to be constrained by conventions, willing to experiment at the very edge of feasibility, and prepared to create something that would shock, awe, and ultimately confound the market. Its legacy today is as much about imagination as it is about engineering. The High 450 SS is celebrated by collectors, historians, and enthusiasts, not for practicality or sales success, but for its pure, unrestrained ambition. It is the embodiment of a moment when a small Swiss company dared to produce a supercar capable of competing with the world's greatest machines, armed nothing but courage, a Chrysler Hemi, and a radical vision of design. Owning or even seeing a high 450 SS is a reminder that automotive history is defined not only by winners, but also by audacious experiments, by cars that stretch the imagination and challenge every assumption about what a vehicle can be. It is a rare, terrifying, beautiful, and utterly unique testament to the extremes of automotive creativity. If you want, I can expand this further into a fully exhaustive, multi-chapter historical account, including Monteverdi's company background, engineering drawings, development hurdles, contemporary media reception, the fate of the 2 surviving cars, and modern collector perspectives, essentially creating a deep, almost book-length saga of the Monteverdi High 450 SS as a Swiss-American supercar legend lost to time.
The 1984 Pontiac Fiero is one of the most infamous and misunderstood cars in American automotive history. A machine that promised a revolutionary take on the sports car formula and instead delivered a bewildering, often dangerous, and almost absurdly flawed experience. Pontiac intended the Fiero to be a bold, groundbreaking mid-engine sports car, something that could compete with European exotics while remaining affordable for everyday Americans. The car's concept alone was ambitious: a two-seat coupe with a rear mid-engine layout, lightweight plastic body panels to prevent rust, and a low-slung, wedge-shaped design that implied speed even when standing still. Pontiac wanted the Fiero to become America's Ferrari, a car that could excite enthusiasts with its futuristic design and agile driving dynamics while remaining a practical, budget-conscious option. In short, it was supposed to be a sports car for the masses, revolutionary, stylish, and fun. In practice, the first-year 1984 Fiero was an almost textbook example of overpromise and underdelivery. Underneath its sleek body panels lay a mechanically compromised platform, hamstrung by budget constraints, rushed engineering, and overly ambitious marketing. The engine that powered this sports car was a mere 2.5-liter four-cylinder Iron Duke, producing just 92 horsepower. For a mid-engine car weighing over 2,200 pounds, this was painfully underpowered, leaving the car sluggish and frustrating to drive. The promised mid-engine balance, the hallmark of true sports cars, was overshadowed by the engine's lack of power, poor throttle response, and a clutch that many owners described as overly sensitive and difficult to modulate. The handling, while theoretically better than front-engine economy cars, was compromised by soft suspension tuning, limited tire technology, and cost-cutting chassis compromises. The car lacked the finesse and precision expected from a mid-engine layout, leaving drivers with the sensation of a car that looked fast but moved like it was dragging invisible weights behind it. Worse still, the early Fiero was plagued by serious safety and reliability problems. Its compact engine bay, coupled with inadequate cooling, caused many cars to overheat catastrophically. Owners reported melted wiring, blown gaskets, and in the worst cases, engines catching fire while on the road, a terrifying reality that became a defining feature of the Fiero's early reputation. GM tried to contain the damage through recalls and redesigns in later models, but for 1984 buyers, the car was effectively a rolling hazard. Insurance rates skyrocketed, and the Fiero quickly gained notoriety as a car that could harm its occupants and terrify its owners before they could even reach a quarter mile of spirited driving. For a vehicle marketed as a fun, sporty, and youthful performance machine, these problems were catastrophic, completely undermining Pontiac's grand vision. The styling of the Fiero, while bold and futuristic in intent, was also polarizing and contributed to the car's confused public perception. Its small wedge-shaped body with sharp angles and pop-up headlights was unlike anything GM had produced before. While the design successfully conveyed a sense of speed and exotic flair, the proportions made the car appear toy-like and almost cartoonish, especially when compared to the sleek, aggressive lines of true European sports cars. The lightweight plastic body panels, while resistant to rust and corrosion, often flexed or rowelled, further reducing the sense of quality and solidness. Critics and buyers alike were puzzled. Was this supposed to be a real sports car, or just a quirky experiment in affordable styling? The answer, unfortunately, was neither. Despite its mechanical flaws and early safety hazards, the Fiero was an audacious experiment, one that demonstrated GM's willingness to explore radical layouts and challenge conventional thinking. Few American manufacturers at the time were willing to produce a mid-engine two-seater, especially on a constrained budget. The Fiero was a car that sought to combine affordability, exotic appeal, and everyday usability, a trifecta almost impossible to achieve simultaneously. Its failure to deliver on performance, reliability, and safety highlights the perils of stretching ambition beyond engineering reality, yet also underscores the uniqueness of the Fiero as a case study in both creative automotive design and corporate overreach. Over the years, the Fiero gained a strange, cult-like following. Later models, especially those equipped with the V6 and improved cooling systems, partially redeemed the car's reputation, offering a glimpse of the performance potential that Pontiac originally intended. Enthusiasts embraced the Fiero for its unusual layout, lightweight chassis, and affordability as a project car, while collectors prize early 1984 examples as bizarre relics of GM's willingness to experiment, for better or worse. The Fiero exists as both a cautionary tale and a testament to daring innovation, a car that promised a baby Ferrari but delivered chaos, compromise, and mechanical absurdity, yet remains endlessly fascinating for those who appreciate the audacity of American automotive experiments. The 1984 Fiero's legacy is a blend of ridicule, nostalgia, and admiration. It is remembered as a car that overheated, caught fire, and failed spectacularly to live up to its marketing hype, yet it also represents a unique moment in American automotive history, a time when a major manufacturer dared to build a mid-engine two-seater and attempt to redefine the notion of an affordable American sports car. It is a vehicle that evokes frustration, laughter, awe, and incredulity all at once, embodying the chaos, ambition, and sometimes tragic comic reality of automotive experimentation. The Fiero is not merely a car, it is a story, a warning, and a monument to what happens when engineering compromises collide with overambitious dreams, producing a vehicle that is as fascinating as it is flawed. I can expand this even further into an ultra-detailed, almost book-length narrative, including engineering schematics, crash test anecdotes, owner horror stories, GM's internal memos, the evolution from first-year disasters to later V6 models, and its cult status among collectors, essentially turning the 1984 Pontiac Fiero into one of the longest, most comprehensive tales of automotive ambition gone wrong. Do you want me to do that next?